Hello, welcome to Board with Paint. Today we'll be kicking off my tutorial series of how to paint Divinity Original Sin, the board game, starting with IFAN. If you're new to the hobby and just getting started with painting, I advise you to check out episode 0, where I show you some of the things you'll need to get started. The miniature is already prepped and primed entirely in black, so let's get started. Before we put any paint on our palette, we want to make sure we give it a good thorough shake. If you haven't used the paint in a while or it's brand new, give it some extra time shaking. Next, we apply the paint to our palette. You can see here I'm using a wet palette that'll help the paint stay wet for longer. But if you don't have one, that's fine. You should be able to achieve the same results. We'll be starting off here with painting the skin using a mixture of Beasty Brown and Cadmium Skin. We're just looking to slightly darken the skin tone a little bit. The brush I'm using to mix the paint is not the brush I'll be using to actually paint the miniature. This will help prevent wear and tear on our good brushes. Once we have the paint mixed to the color we want to thin it down with a little bit of water. I have water in this little dropper bottle, and I'll put a couple of drops into the mix whenever I want to thin it. For our initial layers, we want the paint to be still opaque, but not so thick that it's going to gum up and obscure details on the miniature. Once the paint is thin, we'll get out the brush we'll be using to paint and load it. I'm using this number 2 brush from Green Stuff World. This is part of the Silver series. When we load our brush, we just want to get paint on the tip, as you can see here. You don't want to get any paint up into the ferrule here. If paint dries up in there, it will cause your bristles to separate and will ruin the brush. And now we can finally start to apply paint to the miniature. Obviously, I'm using this color to paint all of the areas of skin. So this is the upper part of the face. We want to leave off the lower part since that's covered in a beard. You're looking for a very thin coat of paint. You don't want to obscure any details. If you see the paint start to pool and actually get some volume to it, that's a sign that you've put too much on, and use your brush to spread that out if you can. You'll probably notice, especially since we're going over black, that the paint does not cover that well. That's completely normal. Most paints require at least 2 coats, some colors even more. For the purposes of these tutorials, I'll generally only show the application of the first coat, but you can assume that I go in when the paint dries and apply a second coat in many cases. Anyways, continuing on, I am now painting his hands. Since this is the first color we're applying, we don't have to be especially neat with it, since our future colors will cover any mistakes we make. I'd recommend trying to keep it under as much control as you can, though, because the less cleanup you have to do later, the better. You'll also want to paint his elbows, which are exposed. I didn't get these until later, and I didn't get it on camera. Sorry about that. When we're finished using a color, we want to clean our brush. And to do this, all we do is swish it around in our jar of water. You can also rub it gently against the edges of the cup on the inside. Just try to get all the paint out of there. Then we take it out and we wick off all of the moisture onto a paper towel. You can see here there's still some color there. So I'm going to go back to the water and swish it around some more. Once we can wipe off clean water on a paper towel, we know the brush is clean. Notice that I'm spinning the brush as I wipe it off. This will help reform the bristles back into that sharp point that we want. And there we have a clean brush. As I said before, the coverage here is not really great. So here we'll start applying a second coat. This is probably the only time I'll actually show you the application of the second coat. The same principles on the second coat apply as on the first coat. Keep it nice and thin and avoid having it pool up and obscuring details. After the second coat, you should have a fairly opaque amount of coverage. If for some reason you don't, it doesn't hurt to do a third coat. Now we'll start to work on the cape. And for this, I'm mixing some black and some Beasty Brown together, about a 50-50 mix. What we're looking for is a near black brown color. This will effectively be the shadow color that we put on the cape. Now we'll just apply this all over the entire cape. Some of the nooks and crannies can be difficult to reach. Just try your best and do touch-ups if you need to. We'll also be using this color to paint the boots, which I'll do partially in metal later, but for now I'm covering the entire thing in this color. We'll speed this next bit up since it's more of the same. Now we'll move on to some Stonewall Grey and use this to paint the fur on the back of IFAN's neck. While you have this out, you can also paint the rock that he's standing on. I don't think I filmed that, but I used a base coat of the same gray color. Now for IFAN's pants, I'm just using pure black. I'm also using this for the shirt that he's wearing underneath the armor. And we'll also use this to paint his hair. To paint the leather armor, we're going to mix black and brown again, but this time we want to go maybe 2/3 brown to 1/3 black. We still want this to be a very brown color, we just want it to be slightly darker than the brown by itself. You can see I am also using this color to paint the bracers around the wrists. Next, we'll paint the metal bits using Chainmail. We'll start off painting the entire crossbow with this. We'll also use this color on the armored plates on his shoulders. Taking a closer look at his boots, it appears that there are some armor plates on the toes and around the shins. So I'm going in and painting that with the chainmail as well. And there he is with all the metal. Here I'm going back to the Stonewall Grey and just painting the little furry tufts that are on the edges of the armor and above the boots. And finally, to paint the belt, I'm just going back to the original black-brown color that we mixed. This is the same color we used on the cape. Now we'll apply some selective dry brushing to bring out some of the details. You'll want to use a brush that has a wide set of bristles like this Citadel dry brush, but you could also use something like this synthetic brush I got from a craft store. Dry brushing is great for bringing out details on highly textured surfaces like the fur on the back of his neck. So here I'm just loading my brush up with some dead white. Then we move over to a paper towel and we start to wipe paint off until there's almost nothing on the brush. With it being white on white here, it's a little hard to see, but take my word for it, it's coming off. I'll demonstrate here on my thumb. To show you how much paint's left on the brush, you can see just a tiny bit comes off when we brush. And now we just brush this over the entire area of that fur. And this will just pick up on the raised surfaces, and it'll hit the edges, and it'll leave the recesses untouched. So this should bring out the texture nicely. We can also do this on the rock. As you can see, dry brushing is a quick and easy way to add some detail without a lot of effort. Next, I'll show you how to apply a wash. This is the flesh wash that came with the paint set. And again, we want to shake it up really well. And I usually put this into a dry palette like this. And you can see this is much thinner than the other paints we've been working with. The purpose of a wash is to allow it to seep into the recesses and details, and it will leave the upper surfaces untouched. So it's kind of the opposite of a dry brush. For this flesh wash, I'm just applying this over all of the skin. And we want to put this on fairly thick and allow it to pool. Once you finish applying a wash, it's very important to let the miniature sit and let it dry completely before you add any more paint. If you disturb the wash when it's partially dry, it can lead to a phenomenon known as coffee staining, where you get these circles like someone left a cup on your coffee table. If you're impatient, you can always use a hair dryer to dry the miniature faster. Now we'll prepare some black wash. We'll be using this on various parts of the miniature. I'm starting here with the rock and putting a wash on the rock. This is just being applied over the entire thing. And I end up applying this over almost the entire miniature, except for the skin and the cape. So anything that's leather or metal is getting covered with this. You'll see especially how it brings out those details on the padded armor. Those little panels show up a lot nicer once the wash has been applied. see here, I'm also applying it to the fur, and in combination with the dry brush we did earlier, this really brings out the depth and texture there. And here he is with the washes applied and dry. You can see it brought out the depth on that armor, brought out those panels, gave everything overall more detail. Now it's time to start some highlighting. We'll start by highlighting the cape, and to do this, I'm just mixing some more brown into the black-brown mix that we created first. For most of our highlights, we'll be using a technique called layering. This involves applying successive layers to the areas that we want to highlight, and we'll progressively get lighter with those colors and reduce the size that we're covering. And this will lead to the illusion of a gradient going from the dark areas to the light areas. For the cape, the highlighting is relatively straightforward. I'm just going through with all of these folds and picking them out with my highlight color. Any part of the cape that is facing downward or that is inside the deepest parts of the folds, I'm leaving alone. You can see this isn't moving the color all that much, but the idea with layering is that as we add the successive layers, they build up and increase the intensity of the underlying color. It's also important to keep in mind that almost any paint that you apply will dry darker than it goes on. And that's because they go on very glossy, they pick up a lot of light. But when they dry matte generally, and you'll see that there is less vibrancy to the color once it's dry. Here's our first layer of highlight on the cape. Now I'm taking that same exact color and applying it again over all the same areas, but this time we're not going to cover quite as much. So we want to keep things closer to the top and the tips of those ridges. And you'll see the saturation of those colors will increase on this second coat. Now we'll lighten our highlight a little bit by adding some Stonewall Grey into this mix. Here I'm adding a little more brown because it desaturated the color a little too much. And here I'm going to thin this down a little more with water. It's important as we add highlights, we keep getting thinner with our layers. This will keep those layers somewhat transparent, so what's underneath will show through, and they'll blend a little bit more nicely and will hide those layer lines between the different transitions of color. And here's the cape fully highlighted. This is probably about as far as we'll go. Now, if you remember, we painted the belt in the same color as the cape, so we'll apply the same kind of highlighting there, and also on the parts of the boots that we kept in leather. And here he is with the darker browns highlighted. Now we'll highlight the rest of the leather with just some pure brown. And here I'm thinning it down with some water again. You can see I went pretty thin with this, so I'm going over to my paper towel and wicking off the excess moisture. This way I don't get paint all over the place and I can still control it when it comes off the brush. And here I'm just applying the paint inside each of those squares on the armor. If you're a little messy with it, it actually makes the leather look a little bit worn. So that's a look you may want to go for on purpose. Note here I'm also brightening up the edges of the armor. We also want to make sure we get the little bit of highlighting underneath the plate armor. And we're also using this color to highlight the bracers. Now we'll highlight the pants and the undershirt by mixing some Stonewall Grey with some black. We're going for a very near black gray for this highlight. It looks to me like there are stripes or some kind of texture on the pants. I'm trying to follow those with the highlight here. Next, we'll highlight the metal parts of the armor, and we'll simply do a dry brush to do this. So here I'm using the paper towel to wipe off the excess paint. You can see how little comes off on my finger. And we're just going to dry brush this over all of the metal parts on the miniature. I decided to boost the shadows a little bit on the leather parts of the armor, and I'm going back to my black wash and just drawing those lines back in directly. You can absolutely consider this an optional step if you don't feel comfortable doing it. One of the reasons I'm doing it is because when I was cleaning mold lines off the miniature, I think I sanded away some of the separation between some of those squares. So here I have to draw it back in by hand. And now for the part we've all been dreading, we're going to paint the eyes. Now for the whites of the eyes, I like to go with sort of an off-white. So I'm mixing some yellow into the white to get sort of an ivory. Then I'm using my Psycho brush, this is the smallest brush I own, and using this to dot in the whites of the eyes. And this is always hard to get on camera. I did the best I could. It's not going to be perfect. Don't worry about it. We will fix it. Once the whites are completely dry, we're going to do the pupils. And the trick for this is you just draw a vertical line through the center of the whites of the eyes. It's important to have white on either side of the black. Again, this is going to look somewhat terrible when you do it, but trust me, it will be fixed in a later step. So here we are at this point. Now to fix the eyes, I'm going in with a color darker than the skin tone. So for this, I'm just using plain old Beasty Brown. And we're going to trace the outside of the eyes. And this is where we really get a chance to shape them. Using a darker color like this will give the eye a sort of sunken in look. So it provides separation between the whites of the eye and the rest of the character's skin. Just keep going around the eyes until they're the shape you like. And you can see this also gets rid of the overdrawn pupils that we did with the black lines. While we wait for that to dry, now's as good a time as any to start working on the base a little bit. This is something that's really quick and easy to do, but I think it really looks cool. We're going to start off here and paint the inside of the runes that surround the base with pure white. You can see I'm being extremely messy with this. I'm not worrying about getting it outside the lines. The important thing is that the white completely fills those recesses. We'll come back to this in a bit. So here we're returning to the face and we're applying our first highlight by basically going back to that original Beasty Brown and Cadmium Skin mixture. My guideline for highlighting faces is to use the sunburn technique. If a part of your face is getting burned by the sun, it gets a highlight. So that's the forehead, cheekbones, nose, and for other miniatures that don't have a beard, we also include the chin there. Getting back to what's on screen here, I'm picking out the individual fingers with highlight. You want to make sure you keep a little bit of darkness between each one so that you can see those fingers from a distance. And now we'll mix a lighter highlight color by adding more of the skin tone. The second highlight gets applied to the same areas. We'll just cover slightly less of the miniature surface. For things like the elbow here, I'm just keeping the highlight on the upper portion and avoiding the bottom. Pay special attention to the fingers and knuckles when highlighting hands. Those are really what make the details pop out. And now we'll start on our final highlight using the pure skin tone. And this is same as before, rinse and repeat. Now we'll paint the hair. And for this, we're mixing some black and blue to get sort of a bluish gray. Obviously, we don't want IFAN to have blue hair. We're just adding the blue to add a little bit of saturation to the hair so it doesn't look too boring. And what we're going to do to paint the hair is just use short strokes that are slightly separated from one another, following the curvature of the head and the sculpting of the hair. You don't necessarily need to do this on the sculpted parts of the hair itself. You can kind of be messy with it. We're going to layer up a bunch of these over time, and it's going to give the hair a lot of volume. To highlight the hair, we'll just add some white to this mix, and as we go up in layers, we'll get closer and closer to pure white. Again, we're using those same short strokes. We're trying to layer these on top of each other, but not necessarily covering what we had before. We want all the layers to kind of be visible between one another. The hair will likely start to look gray to you. That's okay. We will bring it back down. Here we're adding a little more white, and we'll do the highlight again. As we get lighter, we want to make sure that the areas we're highlighting are much smaller. And yet again, add more white. This should be about as bright as we go. We want to make sure that this paint dries completely before the next step, which will be applying a black wash, at least one layer of it. So here we're just painting the black wash over the entire area of hair. This will bring some of that darkness back. It will bring out the details in the recesses, and it will tint all of those bright areas slightly in the black direction. If you get one coat of wash on and you think the hair looks too gray, wait for it to dry completely and add another coat of the wash. While you're waiting for your wash to dry, you can return to the base, and here I'm painting the top part of the base in pure black. Note that I'm avoiding the part that we painted white. We're going to deal with that in the next step. Okay, now here is where the magic happens. I'm grabbing a pretty large brush here, and I'm going to do sort of a heavy dry brush in black. So here I'm brushing off the excess, and we're going to dry brush over those white areas. And what this is going to do is it's going to pick up the raised areas, but leave the white underneath untouched. So if you dry brush over the entire edge of the base like this, you'll start to see that design really pop out. People will look at this and think that you went in and you traced all these little runes when really it's this simple. And there we have it, easy peasy. Now I'm just going back to the black and painting the side of the base, the little rim around the edge. Here I'm just doing an optional finishing touch where I get out the black wash and I selectively add it into areas where I feel like it needs some more shadow. So some of the areas of hair, some of the areas that are separating different materials, like here between the hands and the crossbow, this can just help make the miniature more readable from a distance. I don't really have a prescriptive way to tell you what to add this to. You can see where I'm doing it, and it may be different on your miniature. There's anywhere where you think the shadows need to be a little deeper, you can add a little bit of this black wash selectively. And as I was going through that, I realized I never highlighted these little furry tufts on the boots and the fur at the edges of the sleeves. So I'm going to hit that with some Stonewall Grey now. And for a finishing touch, I decided to draw in some eyebrows with pure black. And here he is with the painting complete. Before we call it done, we're going to protect the miniature with a spray-on varnish. I like to use this spray lacquer from Testors. Just like with priming, I like to do a bunch of miniatures all at once so I don't waste anything. So here I'm popping them back onto the piece of cardboard, and then we'll take them into the garage and give them a spray. Make sure you give the can a good shake, then spray the miniatures from about 6 to 12 inches away, making sure to hit them from every angle. This will cut down the glossiness of the paint and will also protect the paint job from people's grubby hands. And that completes IFAN from Divinity Original Sin. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more like it, and feel free to leave a comment and let me know what you want to see next. If you're looking for more from me, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I usually will post things there as previews of projects I'm working on. You'll get to see what's coming up next. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy painting.